Nobody prepares you for this part of faith. They prepare you for trust. They prepare you for hope. They prepare you for healing stories and answered prayers. But no one prepares you for the moment when God is the one who disappoints you. Not when life disappoints you. Not when people fail you. Not when circumstances collapse. When God does. You prayed for something you truly needed. Not something selfish. Not something shallow. You prayed for a marriage to survive. For a diagnosis to change. For a child to be protected. For a door to finally open. For the pain to stop. You believed. You stayed faithful. You did what you were taught to do, and still, nothing. Not even a clear no. Just silence. For many Americans, this is the moment that quietly reshapes their faith forever. Not because they stop believing in God, but because they stop knowing how to believe in Him. If you have ever whispered, "I don't understand you anymore, God," this story is for you. Before we go any further, let me be very clear. This is not a video about leaving faith. It is not a video about attacking religion. It is not a video about blaming God. It is about something far more honest. What happens to your faith when God does not do what you believed He would? There are moments in faith that hurt in a very quiet way, not dramatic, not explosive, just heavy. You still go to church, you still show up, you still bow your head when everyone else does. But something inside you has shifted. You are no longer angry. You are tired. You do not feel rebellious. You feel disappointed. And that is a word many believers in America are afraid to use about God. Because disappointment sounds like disrespect. It sounds like weakness. It sounds like something you should fix quickly with a verse, or a smile, or a better attitude. But disappointment with God is not a failure of faith. It is often the first honest moment of faith. You do not feel betrayed in a dramatic way. You feel quietly let down. You stop expecting much. You stop asking boldly. You start protecting yourself from hope, not because you stopped believing, but because believing deeply has already hurt once. And in American church culture, we are very good at celebrating miracles. We are far less honest about unanswered prayers. We know how to clap when someone's story turns around. We rarely know what to say when someone's story does not. So people learn to suffer privately. They learn to pray smaller prayers. They learn to hide disappointment behind spiritual language. But inside, a real question remains. What do you do with your faith when God does not come through the way you needed Him to? This may be one of the hardest truths to accept. Sometimes God does not disappoint you. Your expectations of God do. And that sentence can feel uncomfortable, because most of us did not realize we were carrying expectations at all. We thought we were simply trusting God. But very quietly, without meaning to, many of us build a private agreement with Him. Not out of pride, out of survival. It sounds like this: if I stay faithful, you will protect what matters most to me. If I pray honestly, you will step in at the right moment. If I do my part, you will do yours. This is not rebellion. It is human, especially in America. But we grow up in a culture shaped by cause and effect. Work hard and you succeed. Plan carefully and you reduce risk. Do the right things and you earn better outcomes. That mindset does not stop at the doors of the church. It quietly walks in with us. So our faith begins to follow the same structure, not intentionally, but naturally. We believe in God, and we also believe, without ever saying it out loud, that our obedience should produce a certain kind of life, a safer life, a more protected life, a more predictable life. And when God does not follow that script, it feels personal, not just confusing, personal. But here's the painful shift most of us must face. We were trusting God and trusting a story about how God should act. Those are not the same thing. Your disappointment is not proof that God failed you. Whilst it is often proof that a very specific picture of God could not survive real life. And losing that picture hurts, because it was comforting, it was simple, it was controllable. But it was never promised. Here is the part of faith that almost no one warns you about. God never promised control. He promised presence. Those two words sound similar when life is stable. They feel completely different when life falls apart. Control means God steps in and fixes what you cannot fix. Control means the story turns around before it breaks you. Control means pain is temporary and always purposeful in ways you can recognize. Presence is different. Presence means God does not remove you from the fire. He stays with you inside it. For many American believers, this is the real shock. Not that God exists, not that God is powerful, but that God allows you to walk through things you prayed would never happen, and still calls himself faithful. This is where faith stops being theoretical. It stops being something you talk about in small groups and podcasts. It becomes something you carry through ordinary, exhausting days. When people say, God is with you, during loss, it can feel almost insulting. Because what you needed was help. What you needed was intervention. What you needed was a different outcome. But presence is not a replacement for rescue. It is something else entirely. It is what remains when rescue does not come. And that is why disappointment with God feels so disorienting. You were prepared to trust his power. You were not prepared to depend on his nearness. Those are not the same kind of faith. One expects a change in circumstances, and the other survives without one. There is a kind of pain that only silence can create. Not rejection, not correction. Silence. You pray carefully. You pray honestly. You pray when you have strength and when you have none. And nothing seems to move. No shift, no clarity, no deep peace, no unexpected strength, just normal days, heavy days, and unanswered questions. At some point, many believers in America reach a quiet thought they never expected to have. I don't even know what to say to God anymore. Not because they stopped believing, but because they stopped knowing how to talk to someone who no longer seems to respond. Silence feels different from no. A no at least tells you where you stand. Silence leaves you suspended. It makes you wonder whether you were heard at all, whether you prayed correctly, whether you waited long enough, whether you misunderstood what faith is supposed to feel like. And slowly, prayer becomes smaller, safer, less hopeful, because hope now feels dangerous. But here is something almost no one tells you. God's silence is not the same as God's absence. Silence does not mean you are being ignored. It means you are being asked to remain without reassurance. And that is one of the hardest spiritual disciplines for modern believers, especially in a culture that expects feedback, confirmation, and measurable progress. We are not comfortable staying in relationships that stop giving us emotional signals. But faith eventually leads you into exactly that kind of space. A space where you are no longer sustained by answers, only by trust. Disappointment with people hurts. But disappointment with God cuts deeper. Because when a person fails you, you still have somewhere else to turn. Another relationship, another source of support, another voice. But when God disappoints you, there is no higher place to go. You brought your deepest hope to the highest place you knew, and when that place feels silent, you are left with something far heavier than sadness. You are left with spiritual confusion. You start asking questions you never had to ask before, not about life, about God. Was I heard? Was I seen? Did I misunderstand him? Did I misunderstand faith itself? For many people in America, faith is not the first thing they try. They try therapy. They try self-improvement. They try productivity. They try resilience. They try rebuilding themselves. And when none of those are enough, they finally bring their need to God. So when God feels distant at that moment, the disappointment feels final. There is no backup plan. There is no emotional safety net. There is only the quiet fear that maybe the one place you trusted most will not rescue you either. That is why disappointment with God feels so personal. It is not about what you lost. It is about where you placed your hope. You were not looking for comfort. You were looking for meaning. You were not asking for perfection. You were asking for presence that actually changes something. So when that change does not come, your faith does not simply weaken. It becomes exposed. You realize how much of your trust was attached to outcomes, how much of your hope depended on God fixing something, and how much of your relationship with Him was quietly shaped by what you needed Him to do. And when He does not do it, it feels like the relationship itself is under threat. Not because God moved away, but because the way you learned to relate to Him no longer works. That is a frightening place to stand. But it is also an honest one. It is the first moment your faith is no longer protected by expectations. It must now stand on something else. If you are disappointed with God, something inside you may already be accusing you. You should be more grateful. You should trust more. You should stop questioning. You should be stronger by now. But let me tell you something clearly. Feeling disappointed with God does not make you a weak believer. It makes you an honest one. Weak faith avoids pain. Mature faith faces it. And a shallow version of faith depends on protection. A deeper version of faith learns how to remain when protection is not given. In America, we often confuse emotional stability with spiritual maturity. If you are calm, you must be faithful. If you are unsettled, you must be struggling. But some of the strongest believers are not peaceful. They are present. They stay. They keep showing up to God without pretending they understand Him. Real faith does not mean you stop feeling hurt. It means you stop running from the hurt. Disappointment is not the enemy of faith. Pretending you are not disappointed is. Because when you hide your disappointment, you do not protect your relationship with God. You quietly distance yourself from it. You become polite with God. You keep conversations shallow. But you avoid bringing your real grief into the relationship, not because you are dishonest, but because you are tired and afraid that God may disappoint you again. That fear is understandable, but it is not the end of your faith. It is the place where your faith begins to grow up. After disappointment with God, most people do not leave faith loudly. They leave quietly, or they stay quietly. There are two very common responses in American churches and Christian culture. The first is endurance without honesty. You keep attending. You keep serving. You keep saying the right words. But inside you pull your heart back. You stop asking God for anything that really matters to you. You stop bringing your deepest fears into prayer. You stop expecting closeness, not because you stopped believing in God, but because you learned how painful hope can be. The second response is slow withdrawal, not rebellion, not anger, just fatigue. You miss a Sunday, then another. You stop opening your Bible, not because you disagree with it, but because it now feels disconnected from your real life. And over time, faith becomes something you respect from a distance. Both responses look reasonable. Both protect you emotionally, but neither heals what disappointment actually damages. Because disappointment with God is not only about unmet expectations, it is about broken trust. And broken trust is not repaired by silence. It is repaired by truth. But here is the quiet shift that almost always happens underneath both of these reactions. Faith slowly changes its shape, without anyone meaning to do it. It stops being a relationship, and it becomes something else. At some point, very quietly, faith can change its shape. Not in your beliefs, not in your theology, in your expectations. Faith becomes a transaction. You may never say it out loud, but it begins to live in your thinking. If I stay faithful, if I keep praying, if I live the way God asks me to live, then God should protect what matters most to me. This is not arrogance. It is how disappointment tries to make faith feel safe again. A transaction feels controllable. A relationship does not. A transaction gives you rules. A relationship asks you to trust someone you cannot manage. So after disappointment, many believers in America rebuild their faith quietly like this. I will obey. I will show up. I will be consistent. But I will also keep my expectations low. I will keep my heart guarded. I will keep God at a safe emotional distance. Because if faith becomes an exchange, then future disappointment can be explained. I did my part. He did not do his, and that story protects you from the deeper fear. The fear that God is not a system. He is a person, and persons do not operate on guarantees. Here is the painful truth. The moment faith becomes a transaction, disappointment becomes inevitable again. Because God never agreed to that contract. He never promised to become predictable. He never promised to be manageable. He never promised that obedience would shield you from loss. But many of us were never taught how to follow God without building a quiet safety agreement with Him. So when disappointment arrives, we do not lose faith. We lose control. And control is what our culture teaches us to trust most. But here's the part almost no one tells you. Real faith does not begin when God fixes your life. It begins when He doesn't. Most of us start our journey with God because something works. A prayer is answered. A door opens. A season turns around. A crisis passes. And slowly, without realizing it, our faith becomes attached to outcomes. We trust God because life is still moving forward. But there comes a moment for many believers in America when that connection breaks. The prayer is not answered. The relationship does not heal. The illness does not leave. The loss is not reversed. And the version of faith that depended on results quietly collapses. That is not the end of faith. That is the end of a fragile version of it. There is a kind of faith that exists only when God is working for you. And there is another kind of faith that survives when God does not fix what hurts you most. Before disappointment, faith often sounds like this. I trust God because He will come through. After disappointment, faith sounds much quieter. I will stay with God, even when He doesn't. Not because you are strong, not because you understand, but because you have realized something deeper. God is not a tool for your survival. He is a presence inside your suffering. This is where faith becomes a relationship, not a strategy, not a safety net, not a way to manage uncertainty. A relationship. And relationships do not exist to protect you from pain. They exist to keep you from being alone inside it. That is a painful shift. But it is also a freeing one. Odd because you no longer have to pretend that trusting God means expecting a certain outcome. You are finally allowed to trust Him without knowing what comes next. This is the faith that is not powered by hope for change. It is powered by commitment in uncertainty. And for many of you listening in the United States, especially those who were raised in strong church culture, this may be the first time you realize something quietly important. The faith you lost after disappointment was not your real faith. It was the faith you needed to outgrow. Before I continue to the next part, sometimes God does not take away what hurts you. He takes away what you believed about Him, and that can feel far more frightening. For many of us, the deepest disappointment is not that suffering remains, but it is that the story we built around God collapses. The story that says, if I follow God sincerely, my life will stay protected in the ways that matter most to me. But God never promised to protect your comfort. He promised to shape your heart. That does not make suffering good. It does not make loss meaningful by itself. It means that God is not using pain as a tool to teach you obedience. He is using pain to expose illusion. The illusion that faith exists to secure your future. The illusion that obedience creates guarantees. The illusion that God's love is proven by how well your life works. For many American believers, faith has been quietly mixed with a version of the American dream. Work hard, do the right thing, stay disciplined, build a good life. And God becomes part of that structure, a spiritual reinforcement. But disappointment strips that away, not to punish you, to free you. Because as long as God exists mainly to protect your plan, you cannot truly know Him. You only know what you need Him to be. Disappointment hurts because something false is being removed, not because something essential is being taken. God is not dismantling your faith. He is dismantling the version of Him you could manage. And that loss feels personal, but it is also an invitation to meet God as He is, not as the solution you designed, not as the outcome you expected, but as the presence who remains when your story no longer works. Let me offer you something simple, not religious performance, not spiritual formulas, not advice that pretends your pain is small, just honest ways to remain with God when disappointment is real. First, now do not try to fix how you feel. You do not need stronger faith right now. You do not need better words. You do not need to become more positive. You need permission to be truthful. God does not require you to approach Him with a corrected emotional state. He asks for honesty, not composure. Second, speak to God without protecting Him. Stop explaining your pain politely. Stop softening your anger. Stop spiritualizing your confusion. Say what you actually feel. Even if it sounds like disappointment. Even if it sounds like frustration. Even if it sounds like silence. God is not threatened by your emotional honesty. He is not offended by your confusion. A relationship that cannot survive honesty is not a real relationship. Third, stay. Not because you feel close, not because prayer feels meaningful, not because something shifts emotionally. Stay because you are choosing truth over comfort. Staying with God during disappointment is not an emotional experience. It is an act of integrity. It is you refusing to build a new life that avoids Him simply because He did not behave the way you hoped He would. For many American believers, staying feels counterintuitive. We are trained to move toward what works, toward what heals quickly, toward what produces results. But faith is not a productivity system, it is a relationship, and relationships are sometimes carried, not enjoyed. Do not measure your faith by how inspired you feel. Measure it by how honestly you remain. For a long time, many of us were taught a very simple definition of faith. Faith means confidence. Faith means certainty. But faith means believing that God will act. But disappointment quietly forces a deeper definition. Faith is not confidence in outcomes. It is commitment in uncertainty. Not commitment to an idea, not commitment to a system. Commitment to a relationship. Real faith does not say, I trust God because I know what He will do. It says, I trust God even when I do not know what He is doing. That difference changes everything. Before disappointment, faith often depends on clarity. After disappointment, faith survives without it. Before disappointment, faith needs reassurance. After disappointment, faith learns how to remain without guarantees. This is not weaker faith. It is heavier faith. It carries more uncertainty, more unanswered questions, more unresolved tension. But it is also more honest. Because it no longer pretends that God exists to stabilize your life. It accepts that God exists to remain with you inside it. For many people in the United States, especially those raised in structured church environments, this is the moment faith becomes personal for the first time. Not inherited, not expected, not socially reinforced. Chosen. Not because it works, but because it is real. Faith that survives disappointment is no longer fueled by hope for change. It is sustained by presence. And presence is enough to keep a relationship alive when nothing else can. If God has disappointed you, you are not broken. You are not behind. You are not failing at faith. You may simply be standing at the edge of a deeper one. Not a faith that depends on answers, not a faith that depends on protection, but not a faith that depends on things working out, but a faith that knows how to remain. If you are still here, still listening, still wondering, still quietly hoping, that itself is not weakness, it is courage. You do not need to rush past your disappointment. You do not need to resolve it tonight. You do not need to turn your pain into a testimony. You only need to be honest enough to stay, because the end of certainty is not the end of faith. It is the place where real faith begins. And maybe the most important thing you can hear tonight is this: God is not waiting for you to become stronger. He is waiting for you to come closer, exactly as you are.